Hello, everybody. Just me for the very beginning of this because we had some audio issues early on in this, and I cut out and back in the original live stream. So all I'm going to do here is say welcome and tell you a little bit about Antonia because that got cut off. So Antonia is the Associate Director at the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. She's also a trustee of Rethinking Economics, and she has been heavily involved in what's sometimes called the New Economy movement, which is a network of organisations which have sprung up over the past decade or so, trying to advance a more progressive economics. So we talk a little bit about those organisations and what their aims are and what they've achieved. And we talk also about regional inequality, which is something that CLES, who she works for, are very focused on. We talk about community wealth building. We talk about the cost of living crisis. We talk about climate change. We talk about everything, really. So anyway, let's get on with the actual discussion. Hello, everybody in chat. Hello, YouTube is a website. And hello, Antonia. Thanks for agreeing to come on stream.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Very happy to be here.
So, let's just start talking about stuff straight away. I'm just going to ask you about regional inequality in the UK. So there are massive differences between areas of the UK. There's famously the north-south divide. There's a massive gap between London and the rest of the UK. But the thing is, there are also huge differences within cities like London, right? And the so. How do you think regional equality has come about? Why do you think it's a problem? And like, what type of things, policies and institutions are CLES exploring to try and alleviate it?
Yeah, so it's a really big and complex issue. And obviously it's on the agenda at the moment because in 2019, Johnson stood on a platform of, the flagship policy being levelling up. But I think the important thing to say is we've been here before. So I'm 30 years old and every government in my lifetime has pledged to solve regional inequality or, do something around regional development. So it's not a new agenda. Every government in one way or another has tried to address it as an issue. Most notably, under Blair, we had in the late 90s, early noughties, we had regional development agencies. And they were funded to the tune of £15 billion. The amount of money that Johnson's promised to level up the country at the moment is £5 billion. But the point about regional development agencies is not just how much money was funneled into them, although it was 3 times the amount that the current levelling up agenda has got. It's that they did some good work, but did they solve regional inequality? No, they didn't. So it's not just about the amount of money that's going into this agenda. It's about where it's being spent. So if we think about, the differences in regions today, as you said, it's completely extreme. At the very extreme, London's productivity is something like 2.5 times that of the Northeast. And obviously that's really exceptional, but the differences between the remaining regions are still really significant. So to put that another way, the output per head of the Southeast during the first lockdown of the pandemic is similar to that of Wales in non-pandemic times, right? And it's not just output, of course. This is unlearning economics. We're not, bowing to the god of growth. This is mirrored across kind of all other metrics of economic success and economic deprivation. So health inequality, child poverty, equality of opportunity, etc., etc. So it's a very, very important issue that's only going to be exacerbated by the cost of living crisis, because of course those that are going to feel the brunt of the cost of living crisis the most are disproportionately represented in the poorest regions, right? So levelling up is going to be really tough, and it's going to be even more necessary with what's kind of coming down the track over the next few months. But I think the main thing that we need to recognise, given that it's not just about the amount of money, it's about how that money is spent and who's benefiting from it, that we need to recognise that this is about an economic system that's not working well for the majority of people, right? And if the aspiration here from Johnson's government is to level up areas to be more similar to London, then surely, by extension, we need to really unpack or examine whether the London model is working. And actually, on these metrics of deprivation, the people of London are, across a lot of them, doing the worst. I'm sat here in Tower Hamlets, which is a borough within London. Outside my window, I can see Canary Wharf, which is, by a lot of people's accounts, financial capital, or at least one of the capitals of the world. And in Tower Hamlets, 1 in 2 kids are in poverty. So this isn't just about improving productivity and growth, it's about who's benefiting from the development.
That's really well put. Yeah, so that's quite an astonishing statistic you said a little while back, was that the pandemic era GDP, in London was the same as non-pandemic era Wales. Right, that's a pretty astounding difference. That must be like 20% or something like that, 20% difference in GDP. What was that? Sorry,
it's 35. That's the difference.
35. Okay, right. Yeah, even more. Wow. Okay. So, and there's also, I actually just read an article in the New Statesman. I don't know if you saw it, but it was a Londoner complaining about how everybody hates London. And they were saying, some of it's kind of, I'm not so sure, but they were saying that, look, London contains a lot of deprived areas as well, and a lot of people who are going to be hit very hard by the cost of living crisis. Rises in prices in London are generally higher than in the rest of the country. So I suppose my guess would be from what you're saying already is that Clares are looking, both to try and reduce inequality, for instance, between the north and the south, or between Wales and England, and also trying to reduce inequality, within each region and within cities in particular, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the London model is really interesting because on the one hand, there's this perhaps narrative that, the streets are paved with golden honey and everything's wonderful in London. But then actually, the most acute deprivation is felt here. So absolutely, it's not. It can't just be about bring us all up to the standard of London, and it has to be working within cities as a whole. Are they working coherently? And what Clares does specifically, so we work across the country, but solely on a local level, is we work with local authorities, councils, the devolved administrations in Wales and Scotland. Also combined authorities, etc. And we work to advance something that we call community wealth building, which is essentially a model for inclusive economic development. And essentially what it does is it looks at what wealth is within an economy, how can we make sure that it's democratically, what we do with it is more democratically decided upon, more of it circulates within the economy, and also how can we move local economies away from being so heavily focused on inward investment, because historically they have been, and perhaps we'll go on to talk about Preston a little bit later, but there's economies across the country that, from pretty much the 80s onwards have been sold quite a neoliberal inward investment dream, and gotten big kind of multinationals to come into their area. And what they've seen, or why they did that to start with, is because there was promises of huge amounts of money transferring to their local area, and what they saw in practice was huge amounts of money did transfer into their local area, but then flowed right back out again into the pockets of the shareholders of the big multinationals. So community wealth building is about reorienting those wealth flows to make sure that more of it is circular and retained within the local economy.
Yeah, so you anticipated my next question, which was actually going to be about community wealth building and specifically the Preston model, right? So during an era of austerity from about 2010 or maybe 2011, I think the Preston Council, I think they did have a big deal with a multinational. It might have been John Lewis or something, that was going to bring so and so 100,000 jobs to the town, and then the multinational dropped out, and that caused the council to say, well, what can we actually do now? And they turned to this model of community wealth building, which I think might originate in the States, if I'm not wrong. And they did things like promoted worker co-ops. They did things like made sure that they bought from local suppliers. They did things like funded public services. And it seems to be one of the key success stories on the left. And I know that I've certainly appealed to it in the past because it does seem to be a success story. Is this true? I mean, is Preston a success story for the left? And could you tell us maybe a little bit more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think it's hard to sort of definitively say whether it was a success or not. There were massive elements of it that were successful, but maybe, yeah, as you said, it's probably useful to start with what this Preston model is, and then move on to, whether its impact has been good or not.
Mm-hmm.
And as I mentioned, Preston had brought into the classic sort of neoliberal inward investment dream, and then when the financial crisis happened, that's in 2007-8, that dream was crushed. As you mentioned, big investors withdrew from the city. And so then we worked with Preston to figure out whether we could implement community wealth building within the UK for the first time. As you mentioned, it came from, as an idea, sort of a policy idea, Cleveland in the States. And we worked with Preston Council, but also 6 other anchor institutions within the city, brought together by the council to develop what's now known as the Preston Model. And if you haven't heard the phrase before, anchor institutions are large, most often public institutions, but not exclusively. They can be private institutions that are very firmly rooted in place. So they cannot just move to a geographically different area if, they deem the market more viable there. So what do I mean by that? I mean, of course, councils, but I also mean NHS trusts, educational services, so universities, schools, colleges, etc. But then through to also fire and rescue, police, etc. So they're services that cannot just move if they deem that the market isn't viable where they are. So we brought them together and sort of made them realise that collectively they had quite an impact on the Preston economy in terms of how they spent their money, who they employed, to what extent they supported local businesses, etc. And over 5 years following 2007 and 8, we helped these institutions use their combined weight to really drive up levels of spending with city-based suppliers from, I think it was around 38 million to 112 million pounds over 5 years. And so in light of that, they became a lot less reliant on external investment, and the network of these 6 institutions really begun to reshape the market for goods and services to encourage what we'd call more generative business, but essentially more locally rooted companies to establish themselves to grow. And so in terms of the impact statistics that we have for Preston, of course there's that increased spend. So there's £70 million more for the city economy. There was also 200 million more for the regional economy, because obviously local economies are not in this country most often islands. I'm actually working in the Isle of Wight at the moment, which obviously is an island economy, but on the whole, most economies, localities are not islands. And as part of that shift in spend, we saw 1,600 more jobs created. We also saw 4,000 more people being paid the real living wage in Preston. We saw a suite of food co-ops, tech co-ops supported by the anchors to provide goods and services to the anchor institutions. We also saw Preston Council redirect their pension fund to invest in the local area. And there's all sorts of other things. There was local municipal energy schemes created. And what was the overall picture? So Preston moved up massively in the deprivation index. I don't have the figures to hand, but they jumped astoundingly from right at the bottom to sort of within the top 20%. And it was seen as, or it's cited as, the most improved place to live in the UK. So look, is Preston a success story? Yes, by some metrics it is, but there are a lot of issues going on with local economies and councils more specifically that community wealth building can't really account for. I mean, first and foremost, of course, cuts to local government funding from central government since 2010. I always say the statistic because I just think it's shocking and not enough people are saying it. But, since 2010, the average council in this country has now received cuts from central funding to the tune of around 55%. And what's happened alongside that is they're expected to deliver the same services, but we know in this country that the last 10, 12 years haven't been particularly joyous economically, and so they're expected to deliver the same services on half of the money, and there's more demand on those services. Moreover, another bit of another issue that community wealth building can't really account for is how centralized this country is. So we're actually the most centralized country in Europe, and the trend is to become even more centralized.
When you say sorry, Antonia, but
Yeah.
when you say most centralized, what does that mean exactly? So what metric is that using?
So that's essentially looking at what the nature, how services are decided upon, essentially. So to what extent a locality has input and can give direction over, for example, how its NHS trust is run, how its adult social care services are run, etc. Just in terms of strategic kind of input and direction, its decision-making power is the most centralized in Europe.
Wow.
So we're incredibly centralized. We've had incredible cuts to local government funding. Alongside those cuts, actually, what's happened is around 20 years ago, funding to local government was much more means tested. Tested, dependent on the needs of a locality. And alongside that shrinking budget from central government, we've also seen that means testing has by and large gone out the window, and it's been replaced by competition style funding pots, which is another massive issue, right? So, for example, we were talking about levelling up. The Levelling Up Fund is a fund that central government hold that councils have to bid for, and they're in direct competition with each other. And actually, conversely, what you end up often seeing is the councils that are from better off localities are better resourced to be able to put in better bids and are getting more of those more money from those funding pots. So there's so many issues. And then regardless of community wealth building's efforts to move away from inward investment, there's still a massive need for it. A lot of councils in this country don't see themselves as economic kind of development professionals. They honestly see themselves as managing decline, because actually what they have to do year on year is make budget saving measures, and there's more and more pressure to bring in inward investment to kind of prop up the services they can no longer provide. So look, Preston Community Wealth Building, massive success in lots of ways. It's also done a lot to, I think, invigorate the left and provide a blueprint for perhaps what a national government could do later down the line. But there are still massive problems with regards to local economies that community wealth building can't really answer.
Yeah, so I think Preston is a good example where they've managed to do more with less, which is what someone in my chat said. But of course, they are operating in a certain context, and that context has been all of these policies that you were talking about. So austerity in a very centralized country that has changed its policies in a way that benefit richer councils. Shock. And all of these things together mean that councils are basically fighting an uphill battle, right? And so I mean, some of these centralized policy issues, and one that it's a little bit of a segue, but I was going to ask about it because one of the biggest centralized projects that was actually started by the coalition government back when Levelling Up was the Northern Powerhouse. So like you were saying before, like this has had loads of different names and loads of different governments have said they're doing it. But anyway, back then it was the Northern Powerhouse, and they said they'd invest in high-speed rail 2, right? Mm-hmm. And high-speed rail 2, for those who don't know, is a train line that connects London to Birmingham and Manchester and Leeds, although I'm not sure if they're dropping the Leeds part now. But I think they dropped one bit of it. I can't remember quite which bit it was. But this is like tens of billions of pounds being invested in a hope to bridge the north-south divide on a centralised scale. So is this an example of the type of policy that Cles might like to see more of?
So I think that's a fairly good overview of HS2. I think the only thing I'd add is it's been delayed and getting more and more expensive. But I think, there's premise of if we can just get people in the north to London faster, things will be better is flawed. And even on that logic, HS2 is only proposing cutting the journey time from London to Manchester by 15 minutes. So it's not going to make complete waves in, how quick it is to get from the top to the bottom of the country. But when it comes to transport specifically, much more urgent is the need to travel within regions, and particularly when it comes to bus travel. Bus travel's had so many cuts, since the Tories got in 2010. And moreover, if you try and travel east to west in this country, it's also ridiculously hard. Actually, north to south, one of the few functioning lines that we currently do have. But as I said, when it comes to HS2, the project's gotten more and more expensive, and it does highlight as well some of the issues with public-private partnerships. And I think the broad point that you have to make about HS2 or public-private partnerships more generally is the money that we spend on public services, it's just not equivalent to other spending decisions that are made. Of course, price, quality, they're important, but public services, they're existing to serve citizens and not consumers, and they really come to the core of, embodying vital public values, including, democracy, a shared sense of the common good. And we just can't be in a position, which I would say we are with HS2, where we outsource a public service to the highest bidder, see it being delivered in a substandard way, and then because it's a public service that we need, be left with no choice but to pick up the pieces and, pay, frankly, whatever is necessary to make it run. And so, when it comes to HS2, there is an issue with these big glitzy infrastructure projects being seen as, synonymous with economic development. We know that that's just not true. Infrastructure projects bring growth, but the question of who benefits from those, from that growth is never really properly unpacked. And, as we know, the pandemic has starkly revealed, but I suspect you and I knew it, beforehand, growth doesn't have anything to say about inequality or poor health or housing or the climate. And generally, these aspects of the economy have been going in the wrong direction. So I would say that HS2 is really the epitome of a glitzy infrastructure project that so far hasn't really brought any benefit to the people that it's supposed to, either in terms of jobs or travel time or leveling up or whatever it might be. And it points to this need to redefine what economic success is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the part where I reveal that I asked you about HS2 partly because I want to rant about it myself. But yeah, like you said, so the initial cost I think was about 30 billion estimate, and now it's 100. And it's gone up to 100 billion, so it's a 3-time increase, over a 3-time increase actually, and this is not even finished yet. I think London to Manchester is literally fine now. It takes like 2 hours. It's quite a nice train. It's pretty smooth. Going from Cambridge or Nottingham to Manchester is just so slow and painful in this country. Or in the north, going from north to north, you have some trains which actually don't even have toilets on them still. So, you're looking at investing in completely the wrong thing. And of course, there is this issue that you brought up, which is like transportation within cities. I mean, one interesting thing which came up, because I once made a video about rail, and my conclusion was kind of, maybe I shouldn't have made a video about rail, maybe I should have made a video about buses. But then I kind of signed off the video by saying that because I was too lazy to actually make one. So I don't know if you, Cles, and you personally, have you done any work on buses and how they can improve cities and rural areas as well, especially for the poorest?
So I'll be honest and say we have done work on buses. It's not my area of expertise, but I do know that there's been lots of really interesting campaigns to save buses, particularly in Manchester, which has been really bolstered by Andy Burnham's commitment to, as much as possible, bring bus services back in-house, which, will be really great. But I think when it comes to new economic thinking and, levelling up and buses, one thing that we definitely can say that historically, I know this sounds niche, but there's a lot to be taken from it in terms of wider lessons for kind of progressive implementation of progressive policy. But buses and the departments that historically have run them have actually been really good at community engagement, and bus routes have been decided off the back of like really good and proper consultation with the people that need them the most. And when we're thinking about all the other challenges that we face at the moment, whether it's climate or housing or whatever, there's very much a feeling, I think, amongst a lot of people that these decisions are being made above, and put on them. And actually, we know at Claire's that it's the people who need whatever the service might be that are best placed to say, to outline the contours of how it might run. And so, on the one hand, I am saying that buses are in a bit of a sorry state in this country, which they are. However, it's an extra shame because the historical kind of community engagement around buses has been really good.
I mean, trains are quite they're kind of centralized and they're kind of alien, right? They might just plow through a community and put a railway there, and there might be stops or there might not be. If it's a long train, there probably won't be stops in, there'll be stops in a very small proportion of the towns and villages it passes. Whereas to create a bus route, you actually have to have quite a fine-grained understanding of the community. So it's really interesting that you said that they're historically almost more democratic by design, right? And more engaged with the community. So I was just wondering, as somebody who works in what's sometimes called the New Economy movement, which is the title of this video, and that includes organizations like Claire's, it includes places like the New Economics Foundation, it includes Rethinking Economics, where you're also a trustee. These organizations seem to have come about, and they especially seem to have entered the limelight over the past decade, I think since the 2008 financial crisis, offering basically an alternative, broadly progressive approach to economics that is kind of anti-neoliberal and also kind of anti-neoclassical. And so, I mean, could you comment a little bit on the emergence of the new the new economy movement? I get confused with all these different names. And like, as somebody who's been involved in it from the start, and how it's grown and what its aims are.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's funny you got confused with the names. I sometimes think there's about 20 words in the sector, and if you pick 3, you probably have the name of a new organisation. But that's a side note. So yeah, as you said, over the last 10 years, the sector's grown massively. Both the organisations that were already in it, such as the New Economics Foundation, the IPPR, for example, but we've also seen a big suite of new organisations founded, and a lot of new funding coming in. And so obviously just their existence in and of itself doesn't mean they're doing any good. So it is, really important, I think, to scrutinise their impact. But I think if we think about what the ultimate aim of these organisations are, and they're similar, but they are different, but I'd like to think they're all pushing loosely in the same direction. But if the ultimate aim is to have more progressive policy implemented in this country, then that's fine as an aim, but obviously there's quite a few components that sit within that and sort of lead up to it and strengthen that as a sort of achievable aim. So there's, of course, having the ideas themselves. There's also building a movement and support around those ideas. And then there's also proving that those ideas work and kind of iteratively testing them. So, I mean, maybe if we take them in that order, the ideas themselves, movement building, and proving the ideas work.
Sure.
In terms of sorry, did you say something?
Yes, I just said sure, let's do that.
Okay, that sounds great. So yeah, maybe taking them in that order, ideas, movement, and proving that they work. Ideas, of course, that the organisations are doing groundbreaking policy work, and they're getting a lot of press attention around them, and they're also, unlike a lot of perhaps older think tanks, they're very current. They're addressing, the real issues of the day, whether that's the pandemic impact, on environmental breakdown, on the cost of living crisis, on, changes to how we work. So they're very on the pulse, because generally these are small, quite agile organisations. And then in terms of building movements around them, because there's no point hiding all of our best ideas in 70-page reports if no one reads them or finds out about them. So obviously, once we have these ideas, we need to think about dissemination. And I would say that that's something that the sector needs to work on. But having said that, we're getting better, and ideas are being disseminated. There's campaigns that are being run. There's more press coverage, and there's more people that, are understanding and also calling for the ideas that are coming out of the sector. And maybe to put that into a few practical examples, we've seen the exponential rise in of interest in the 4-day week, for example. More broadly, when it comes to the climate emergency, we've had, the sector is not a closed box. Hopefully it feeds into other social movements and all the rest of it. But if you think about, for example, the rapid rise in XR, it took a lot of the ideas from the sector and actually obviously mobilized en masse, and by and large got its original 3 demands. So its first original 3 demands were to set a net zero date, which was around their telling the truth demand, and that was set. There was also something about, I can't remember how it was phrased exactly, but about disseminating the information properly and for Parliament to take it seriously. And shortly after they started campaigning, they got a climate emergency. And then thirdly, they asked government to be the change, essentially, and also engage with citizens to figure out what that change is. And shortly after they set up, they launched shortly after they started campaigning, government launched a citizen assembly. So I'm not saying that XR is even within the new economy movement, but hopefully the idea of the movement overall is to support existing social movements that are out there and put some kind of policy substance behind, people's motivations and, frustration with inequality that they're seeing around them. So when it comes to building movements, I would say we're doing okay, but there's still more for us to do. I think there's definitely more for us to do when it comes to co-creation of policy. I think there's a bit of an issue sometimes around the fact that we as a sector are trying to help the most marginalised and the most vulnerable in society, and while simultaneously knowing that they're best placed to sort of feed into the creation of those ideas, we don't engage with them very well. And so, obviously true co-creation of policy is not just one focus group, for example, with people from a marginalised community. It's more sustained, it's engaged, it's a lot harder to do. And then, I said the third part of maybe their objective to implement progressive policy is to prove ideas work. Mm-hmm. And actually, particularly when it comes to Cles's work around community wealth building, I think they're doing really well at that. It's no secret that we haven't had a progressive government in this country for 12 years. That looks, pretty unlikely to change anytime soon. So we need to be looking at other ways to create an evidence base for what works in terms of progressive policy. We can't, if we were elected tomorrow, just go back to 2009 and start, reinventing our policy and trying to implement them today. We need a more current kind of evidence base. And that is literally what community wealth building is doing, on a local level. And it's building up a movement, and it's also, giving us really crucial impact stats as well. And it's also providing a lot of hope, I think, that things can be different. This is a difficult time, I think it's fair to say, for progressives. And I would hope that community wealth building can provide something to mobilise around and get excited about. So how's it doing? It's doing okay. It's always really hard to link kind of a sector's work to national policy if the national government is not naturally aligned to what we're doing. And obviously I could point to a few examples and say, oh, maybe the Tories would have done something further right wing if it wasn't for our existence. It's very hard to draw that correlation, but we do know that politics and wider civil society exists in an ecosystem, and it does feel, in terms of the work that we're doing and the coverage we're getting, the more and more supporters we're getting, the fact that lots of things within the pandemic were a lot announced from government by the pandemic were a lot more progressive than we thought. It does feel that we are having an impact, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so difficult. No, thank you very much. It was a very comprehensive answer. It's so difficult to know whether any given movement has an impact, and it's also kind of difficult, as you alluded to know what exactly counts as the new economy movement and what doesn't count as the new economy movement. I mean, I do always think of the example of like industrial policy. Because there was the very famous book by Mariana Mazzucato and who called The Entrepreneurial State, and I think a lot of stuff by the New Economics Foundation, for example, drew from that and the evidence that industrial policy can work and the state can do good things, which is very anti-neoliberal. And you did see some changes in policy, not just in like Corbyn's potential Labour government, but also in actually the Conservatives. Now, as always with the Tories, it's difficult to tell if they're just saying they're going to do stuff and then not actually doing it. But you do see some concrete impacts. So yeah, I wanted. So you were talking a lot about the new economy movement being kind of detached from the people that maybe it was trying to help. And it's something which worries me a little bit because, I mean, you get a similar problem in academia, right? A lot of academics are like second generation academics, and a lot of them are middle class, and there's issues of race and there's issues of gender, especially in the economics profession. And it really doesn't necessarily represent the population as a whole. And I wonder if there's a similar problem in the new economy movement, especially with regard to class. And, if so, what type of things could maybe be done, not just to have more people from, working class backgrounds within the movement working, which would also be good, but just in the sense of actually engaging in dialogue with people from different backgrounds.
Yeah, I think it's a really good challenge, and I share your concern around it being too middle class. As I said, any movement should represent the communities it seeks to serve, and we don't, frankly. And I think that stems from a few things, but in the main, I think it stems from the fact that despite the fact that the movement is working to alleviate the worst impacts of neoliberalism, we're also completely a product of it. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, we're resource constrained. There's high levels of competition between organizations, competing for influence, column inches, but also funding. And then on top of that, there's no set career path. It's quite individualistic. And then as part of all of that, there's very few opportunities at entry level, particularly with minimal experience. And then alongside that, it's not particularly well known, I don't think, as a sector to work in. I think we're very, very far from, a careers advisor at school recommending it. But I'm not even sure that my mum fully knows what I do, despite me being in it for 10 years.
Me neither.
Yeah. So look, we need to, I think really, really crucial to this is expanding internship opportunities, paid internship opportunities, of course, and entry-level roles. And we need to co-create policy better. And what does that look like? That is a really long, hard job. You need trusted messengers in marginalized communities. I cannot go down the road to the Bangladeshi community centre and say, hello, I'm here to serve you. I've got a really good idea for you, without a proper trusted messenger and an in and that confidence. But then we also need to work to embed ourselves more within social movements. So I think the sector, as or the policy sector more generally, it sits awkwardly between academia and government. And so people don't really know where to place us. And we don't have the engagement with social movements that we should do, frankly, given the stuff that we're advocating for. So I think we need to embed ourselves more in social movements, and also I think we need to embed ourselves better with the trade union movement. I think, it's quite shocking to me that the trade union movement is arguably the largest, best funded, not most impactful necessarily, but impactful force in terms of progressive politics in the UK. And yet the new economy movement does a little bit of work with them, but it's not dovetailing completely. And I know they are different things, and they do have slightly different agendas, but I think there's a lot more crossover that needs to happen. And ultimately, whether it's the trade union movement, social movements, the new economy movement, we are all pushing in the same direction against, massive headwinds coming in the other way. So I can't help but feel that by working a bit more together, we could be, a sum of more than our parts, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like there's a lot of different organizations and movements, like trade unions and the new economy movement, and you mentioned Extinction Rebellion, who share the same aims, but you don't often see them working explicitly together, which strikes me as quite strange. I mean, is it just a strategic and communication problem? Is there like a difference of opinions there? Do you know, are there serious differences in opinion? Is there a concrete reason that it hasn't kind of cohered?
Yeah, there's a few reasons, right? But it's all of the reasons that you just mentioned. So, as I said, it's a resource constrained sector. So when it comes to collaboration, there's very little capacity to do so. Most of these organizations are working from grant to grant with very specific objectives aligned to them, and because there's no history of collaboration, they're not inbuilt into budgets, and so it doesn't really happen. There's no capacity to do it, and there's no blueprint for how to do it, because historically we haven't. And then, in combination with that, you and I will be the first to say that, the left loves to argue within itself. And you can say what you want about, the right of politics or the right of economics, or however you want to term it, but they are pretty strategic and they're pretty ruthless. They will all unite under one banner if it's expedient for them to do so. And I just don't think that we do the same on our side. If you look at whether anything from Green New Deal movements, of which there are a number, Momentum splitting into a number of different groups, Momentum, the Corbyn affiliated kind of campaigning organization, or Green New Deal efforts. It's a sort of People's Front of Judea situation. And I can't help but think why, and think, if we all, frankly, were a little bit more strategic about what we're doing and realize that this isn't just an exercise in trumping each other with academic debate, we could do a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, I always remember when everyone in the Tory party for a bit was trying to undermine, I think it was Theresa May, right? After Brexit and everything. And, they were all, I mean, what the Conservative Party's like, they were all stabbing her in the back and blah, 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 until there was the suggestion that Jeremy Corbyn might be Prime Minister. Then suddenly, everyone in the Tory party is like, no, okay, we may not like Theresa May that much, but certainly we much prefer her to Jeremy Corbyn, and they all completely united. Like, I honestly, I mean, I didn't realize Momentum had split into factions. That's it's really the narcissism of small differences, isn't it? Antonia, if you don't mind, so I've got more things that I want to discuss with you, but I have collected a couple of questions from chat. Because I don't want chat to feel neglected. So there's a few questions I've collected. So Atif, right at the beginning of this stream, asked, "Are you familiar with the Infrared Collective?"
No.
Okay, that was a quick question. I get asked a lot of random stuff like that on chat. Are you familiar with blah blah blah? It's just like, that is such a specific question, man. I don't know. So okay. So Oh, here's an interesting one. So means testing. So you mentioned means testing at the beginning of the stream, and I think you were actually talking about means testing of councils by central governments. Right.
Yeah.
I think this person might mean means testing of individuals, but it's a really interesting topic. So I'm going to
Mm.
ask this question anyway. So YouTube is a website asked, means testing is sometimes regarded as a busybody or technocratic practice in austerity among some left-leaning circles. How does it fit into good policy and where does it go wrong?
Yeah, that is a good question.
Oh, did I just get memed? Okay, the infrared collective's like a joke or something. Okay. Oh, no.
Oh,
All right.
right.
All right. Cheers, everyone. I've been owned online. Anyway, sorry. Back to means testing.
Um, I mean, I think it it can be a bit crude, and I think, means testing is only as good as the criteria that you put within it, right? So if, again, going back to this point around growth and investment, if an area is decided, to be in particular need, um, okay, let me rephrase this. So, for example, one of the reasons that HS2 was most likely given the go-ahead was because it was seen that there were workers in Manchester who were fairly high earners, fairly productive, that if gotten to London quicker, there would be this rippling multiplier effect kind of across the country, that would presumably trickle down, to the poorest communities in the UK. Obviously, we know that's not the case. We know that, that kind of benefit doesn't trickle down by and large. So means testing can sometimes overlook, the most vulnerable communities, because, for example, HS2 would have been never approved to get from the east to the west of the country because there wasn't that existing base of productivity and ultimately wealth, right? So means testing has its limits. It's only as good as the criteria that you put in it. But I guess my point is that overall, if the criteria are correct, that is exactly how we should be deciding how money is allocated. Because, as I said, that what's happened in councils is that means tested funding has dropped off massively, and it's been replaced by these competition style pots, which mean, again, some councils that are better resourced to bid for them are getting more of the money. You also find councils that are next door to each other that could be putting in collective bids, suddenly competing and not working collaboratively when it comes to services, etc., etc. And then moreover, when you have these competition self-funding pots, it's no surprise that, as we have a Conservative government, the criteria for how you get the money out of this funding pot is a kind of Conservative aligned set of criteria. So shock horror, if you're a very left-leaning council and you put a left-leaning bid into the fund that doesn't align with their criteria, you're less likely to get it. So it's a kind of self-consolidating, reinforcing pot of money that kind of skews money and development towards a certain ideology. So I think that's my main issue, is that I'm not saying means testing is perfect, but the fact it's been replaced with these competition style pots is a lot worse.
Yeah, okay. There's a really good point. I think this competition system, I mean, it sounds like you're going to have the kind of situation that maybe you already have in London, but you're going to exacerbate it where you can literally cross a street and the roads and everything around you just clearly gets much worse and declines in quality, right? Because the councils are just they're not cooperating. They're just kind of taking care of their own, and you get these especially the richer areas just look like some of the best off areas in the world, right? They are some of the best off areas in the world. They're just full of wealth, and then and then you cross the way, and you're literally like you're in a different country or something. So yeah, I think means testing. It's interesting to hear a defense of means testing in some contexts, because on in the weird internet niche that I inhabit, it is definitely a dirty word now, because I think people are just saying give everyone kind of universal benefits, and they don't like the idea of, for example, for work requirements, right, for benefits and things like that. But it's interesting to hear that actually, in terms of allocating money to councils, it's probably the best system that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
think that, yeah, there's means testing for big pots of investment, and there's means testing for individuals. And so and they are two different things. And I'm the first to advocate for universal basic services of some provision and all of the knock-on kind of benefits that brings. But the reality is, take for example environmental breakdown and the climate emergency. The road to net zero in Hackney is going to be very different to in the Hebrides, right, in Scotland. And so given the needs of those very, very different localities that, in every, environmentally, culturally, industry-wise, are completely polar opposites apart, it would make sense that we do not need a blanket amount of funding that goes across the country to solve that challenge, right? So that's kind of more what I mean by means testing, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're looking at reducing those inequalities, then it sounds like you really do need means testing. So, Ben Perry has asked a question which I think I know the answer to, but I wonder if I'm wrong. Have there been any econometric papers investigating community wealth building and its outcomes?
No. So do you know what? Measuring the impact of community wealth building is a massive underdeveloped area. Actually, I just received a request from a PhD student yesterday who reached out and said, I'm writing a PhD on community wealth building, and am I missing something? But I can't find any academic papers on its impact or even on it as a concept overall. And so in short, we need to get much hotter and better at impact. So far, impact has been largely qualitative, which has its purposes but also has its limits. So econometric papers are definitely needed, but I think part of the reason to give us some credit that that's the case is because it's a very new idea, and Preston is possibly the oldest formal example of it within this country, and that's only been going 10 years, right? And actually, when you're talking about reversing, a decades-long trend within the local economy, 10 years is still a relatively short amount of time. I would probably argue that actually Preston now is in a point where we've got really good baseline stats and we can track, the impact of community wealth building. But Preston is, as I said, the oldest example of formal community wealth building in this country. And the rest are much newer. And inherently, when it comes to redirecting spending, energizing your local business space, improving, employment standards within the local area, they have long-term impact. You cannot measure them over a 3-month period, right? Like you need to see both the direct impact and the kind of co-benefits that come from that sort of policy over, a number of years.
Yeah, absolutely. To do econometrics, you have to have a reasonable amount of data, and I don't think community wealth building satisfies some of the assumptions that econometrics requires, to be honest, as well as the data requirements. And I wonder if it ever will. It's one of these broad historical things. It's hard to just kind of randomly start community wealth building somewhere. It tends to go hand in hand with social changes and political changes. So I don't know. I mean, I would welcome any attempt to try and dig through the data on it, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. But good luck to that PhD student. That sounds good. And academics, definitely need to do more stuff on it. It's such a blind spot, especially for economists. Economists don't do anything on worker co-ops either. Like they just incapable of seeing anything outside the existing system. But perhaps that's another discussion. Chat. I don't know what the hell you're all talking about, but what's wrong with you guys today? They're like literally talking nonsense. You're giving Dolphin Expert, my mod, a headache. And so a couple of people asking about the topic of this. So I just called it the New Economy Movement, which is like basically a constellation of organizations which have tried to advance progressive economics on the left. Specifically, Antonia Jennings, my guest, works for the Center for Local Economic Strategies. So we're talking quite a lot about regional inequality, both across regions in the UK and also within regions and within cities. So really, I mean, this is a chat that could potentially go anywhere. I think we're probably going to talk about the cost of living crisis. We're probably going to talk about the environment as well. So it's quite wide ranging. Please feel free to ask questions that are on topic. and stop talking nonsense. Right. So, the cost of living crisis, which I just mentioned. So this has been an issue for a long time. The Resolution Foundation, and the Roundtree Foundation, I think, maybe mostly the Resolution Foundation. They've been talking about it for as long as I can remember, the cost of living crisis. But with the pandemic, it has really come into the spotlight, and with, I think, the war in Ukraine, some of the rises in the wholesale price of gas and oil, and I wonder, I've done a few research streams on this, trying to get to the bottom of what is driving it, and I wonder what your take on this is. Now, the obvious answer is it's very multifaceted and complicated. But I wonder what you think are some of the main issues in this cost of living crisis debate, and how somewhere like Claire's has approached them.
Yeah, so I think you're right to point out it's a confluence of quite a few crises. With good reason, fuel is getting a lot of attention at the moment, which is fine, but that's a very recent crisis in terms of its extremity. But a lot of the other crises have been building for decades, right? And in particular, there's a crisis of poor work in this country, with the majority now of people living in poverty being in work. And I think the thing to stress, as I'm sure your listeners know, but this wasn't solely created by COVID, right? We already had over a decade of underinvestment and, close to obliteration of a lot of public services pre-pandemic, right? So in short, we were already on shaky foundations. And now what we're seeing is the results of a pandemic exacerbating these trends, and particularly the fact that within our public services there is no safety net, there's no slack. If there's ever any extra pressure put on them, there's nowhere for them to go, they collapse. So what's the product of it now? We've got 1 in 3 kids in poverty, we've got about the same number of adults living below the minimum income standards, and yeah, we've got, winter just gone was bad, but winter coming up is going to be even worse. Just this week we saw what was his name, Martin Lewis, who's the head of E.ON, the utilities company, come out and say after the price cap rise in October, we can expect up to 40. Oh, excuse me. Do you know what? My screen has just said it's going to shut down in 5 minutes, and I have no idea why.
Okay.
That's not very good. All right, I think it's sorted. So yeah, Martin Lewis came out this week and just said after the energy price cap rise in October, we can expect up to 40% of households to be pushed into poverty. 4 in 10, right? That's millions of families that are unable to afford food. And we're the 5th largest economy. It's nothing short of a disgrace. We've got more than enough resources. This is about who owns the resources and how they're being used. And I think the other thing that really needs to be stressed in this debate is that the cost of living crisis is not being felt equally. There are many companies in this country that are making huge profits and extracting wealth for their shareholders right out of our communities and directly at the expense of the most vulnerable. So I don't want to just fluff the answer or say it's quite a few things, but it is quite a few things. But the point is, it's not an acute pandemic crisis. It's been building for years, and the pandemic's just exacerbated it and tipped it over the edge.
Yeah, so one of the things I saw, and the name escapes me, of the organization, but like you said, it's one of 3 of 20 terms that you can put together from the new economy movement. So there was something about community and something about energy in there, and they basically calculated the impact of when David Cameron, the former UK Prime Minister, said, we're going to cut all the green crap, and then select things like solar installations, insulation, wind farms. They all dropped like precipitously. It was actually pretty wild. From year to year, there were like 80% drops in the installation of these things after David Cameron abolished the policies promoting them. And this organization calculated that, I think that's costing households about £150 a year now. So like these kinds of austerity policies, and that, that's just one example, but they can have really long-lasting impacts. So, I mean, I don't know if you knew of any other kind of specific austerity policies that had that kind of impact.
Well, I mean, of course, I'm going to keep pivoting back to this, but across the board cuts to public services, and let me just put that into some kind of worked example. But if you have cuts to education and education in an area goes down, you see a knock-on effect of rising crime. For example, you might see slowing down or even reversal of house price rising, and with all of that, you'll have increased pressure on public services. More people will be pushed into fuel poverty. The police will have a greater job on their hands, and so these things ripple through the economy, and the multiplier effect is massive. And often, the cut to one public service directly impacts the next public service that's also been cut. So I think that's definitely one. But if we think about more broadly, kind of the main areas of the economy that are set to struggle because of the cost of living crisis, it's deprived communities that are disproportionately affected by the rise in energy bills, etc. It's businesses which have been negatively affected by COVID, and it's also individual income, right? And ensuring that incomes are rising with the cost of living. And you look at each of those areas, so deprived communities, SME base, and incomes, the austerity years did really very little for any of them, right? So we had, when it came to income, we had really meagre rises in the minimum wage. When it came to communities, deprived communities, the £20 universal credit uplift hasn't been retained. When it comes to businesses which have been negatively affected by COVID, they are not the businesses that have benefited whatsoever from these public-private partnerships or big swathes of inward investment. In fact, they've been struggling to survive regardless of those, and then the pandemic's hit. So I think kind of from whichever angle you look at it from, it's this confluence of crises that's now reaching this acute tipping point moment. And I can't escape the fact, the stat that I gave earlier, that the head of E.ON came out with, that after October we can expect up to 4 in 10 households to be in fuel poverty. I mean, 4 in 10, that's pushing 50%, and this is for all intents and purposes an affluent country.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The cuts in public services have definitely negatively impacted communities. I suppose the other aspect of it that you mentioned, now this is one I'm kind of skeptical of. It's the money that companies are making and the profit that they're making. Now, the reason I'm skeptical of it is not because their profits are low, because a lot of them aren't. I think a lot of water companies make quite a lot of money and potentially provide a very shoddy service. It's clear to me that the gas and electricity distributors, actually not the retailers, but the distributors, they have the highest profit margins in the UK. And also, we've just seen that BP and Shell have announced record profits, right? So that's all very clear to me. It's clear to me that in some sense it would be justified to take that money and redistribute it to the people. My issue is this, and this is what I looked into a lot on my cost of living research streams. It's that even if you do that, even if you calculate like the amount that you would get from doing that, it's actually all of them: gas, electricity, water, and fuel, including Keir Starmer's windfall tax based on his own estimates. You end up with a distribution to households of around half of the increase in gas and electric bills that we're going to see this winter. So, I think the dividend to the people would be about 300, and the increase we're going to see this year alone, is going to be 600, right? And I just wonder if, I mean, it makes a good political rallying cry. I don't disagree with it ethically, and sure, some households are on the breadline. I understand that every little helps, but I just wonder, would it not be better just to extend the pandemic kind of furlough scheme and basically just send $1,000 to every household, or maybe even the bottom 50% of households? I don't know, I'm undecided, and just do something much more, much larger in magnitude. And I think that would have a much bigger effect on poverty. I mean, I don't know what you think of that whole debate.
I think you're right. But look, we've had 2.5 odd years of this pandemic, and we've been lurching from emergency measure to emergency measure because we've had acute moments of crisis, right? So we bailed out. We had a suite of bailout packages in the early stages of the pandemic because businesses were about to collapse, and I don't see the reason why we shouldn't also have a bailout, for the individual. But what I would say is I think we need both, because fundamentally, if you do a windfall tax and you give every household, whatever it might be, 300 quid or so, great, and that does genuinely make a huge difference to a lot of families, that are surviving on an absolute pittance week to week. But fundamentally, it doesn't restructure the economic system, right? So you need to start to tackle that. And I think, bringing back furlough, or putting it, as other countries have done, on a permanent footing, to give businesses more confidence, it could be a really interesting measure. But I think, I think basically it's not either or. I think you can do both. But I think if you just do the windfall, or you just give a payout, there's nothing basically stopping the model returning to the same place it was, and and people suffering. And there's no reason why we wouldn't be in this position every year, and every year we're calling for a new windfall tax. Well, if that's the case, then we need to change something permanent. But alongside that as well, we need to have less reliance on these energy giants, full stop, right? So we do need to be, obviously you mentioned that Cameron, cutting a suite of green measures had knock-on effects. It's had huge knock-on effects, and we need to, reorient policy to be focusing on building up community energy generation, working with public institutions so they can be self-sufficient. There's a couple of really great examples of this. There's an NHS trust actually in Staffordshire who basically audited their roof space, realised they had loads of unused roof space, couldn't afford to put solar panels on, so they launched a community share offer that lots of members of the community bought into. So they launched a community share offer to raise the funds to put solar panels on the roof. Now the trust supplies itself with its own electricity. Those that invested in the fund get a small return on their investment each year, and the whole scheme is also partnered up with a local fuel poverty charity, meaning any excess profits go to help the fuel poor in Staffordshire. And that's a completely self-contained, amazing system. And I know that's one, but there's no reason why that can't be replicated across the country. And we need to both do the windfall. We both need to support businesses in a more long-term way, or individuals in a more long-term way, but we also just need to stop reliance on these giants, full stop.
That's a really interesting policy. I think, it's a good example of another one of these experiments with alternative policies that's been happening. So yeah, I mean, I think it's like that meme, right? Why not both? Somebody contacted me after I was looking into the water companies, and they said that they're an engineer at a water company, and so they had some insight, and basically, among other things that they do, they have so much wastage from pipes, right? Like so much water goes missing, and they literally just cannot be bothered to fix it because they have absolutely no incentive to improve the efficiency. And it was a really interesting example. I need to look into it more. But like these companies, they're just not particularly well run, and the trains get, they don't. There's just been an underinvestment and malinvestment in the trains. You compare them to a lot of other countries; they have much better trains. So I think you're talking about a long term as well as a short term project, right? Although, but to emphasize, we should send everybody £1,000, I think, in the short term. So let's talk about housing, because I think really, actually, it kind of dwarfs everything else in terms of like cost, right? I mean, you and I both live in London, and rents are extraordinarily high, and whereas bills might be a few hundred a month, housing can be nigh on 1,000 a month, right? For some people. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on what's driving the housing component of the cost of living crisis, and like what could be done about it.
Yeah, housing is really difficult. There's like a few different issues, I think, that feed into it. There's an issue around land values, right? There's also, frankly, the fact that we just don't have enough homes. I work with councils across the country. They're frankly unable to meet their housing targets year on year. And then on top of that, the homes that are existing, particularly when people are so squeezed in every other direction, are falling into disrepair and accentuating the fuel poverty crisis, right? So we just have so many different facets of what's going on. Alongside that, we have the pressure on councils because of these budgetary saving measures to sell off their council housing. We have a very confusing mix of public and private and somewhere in between providers, all of which are kind of outsourced to each other, and all of which are putting a premium on, whether it's the service charge or whatever it might be that you pay for your building. And so there's lots of issues that underpin it. I'm going to be frank and say I'm not a housing expert, but I do also see housing as obviously it's one of the biggest challenges, or contributing factors to the current state of the UK, but it's also one of the biggest opportunities as well. We have really quite ambitious targets around retrofitting insulation, for example, the building of new houses and that sort of thing. And I often think that when I go into a council and they say, come and do community wealth building with us, it's frankly because they look at the state of their local economy and something's gone wrong, right? And so they're like, okay, can we retrospectively put a community wealth building lens on it to try and fix it? But with housing in particular, new home development, the need for retrofit, all these different things, these are all going to be new markets that we can get right from the off, and they can have massive benefits in terms of alleviating the climate crisis, alleviating fuel poverty, creating thousands of really good quality local jobs. So housing is very difficult. There's lots of different things feeding into it, but there's also a lot of opportunity within it. I think it just obviously not only requires ambition, it requires funding, which is also going down for housing.
Is this another area where, like you were saying at the beginning, we might need some more centralized policy rather than just, things like community wealth building? Do we need to have bigger changes in the context?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think community wealth building can do a lot, particularly as I was saying around, building up a movement and providing an evidence base for what works. But, at the end of the day, it can't do everything. And in terms of, the scale of borrowing, for example, or national policy around, any kind of facet of housing, that kind of does have to be, given how this country is structured, decided at the national level. But this isn't an issue of resource. This is an issue of political ambition. Like through the pandemic, the government had the objective of temporarily, for some reason, taking homeless people off the streets at the worst peak of the pandemic. And it did it very quickly and at very little cost. So this isn't, it's not a resource question. It's a political ambition question.
I remember, even friends who maybe weren't that politically engaged were just like, to me, oh, right, so they can just put homeless people in hotels and then they can just like have somewhere to live. And it's like, sometimes, I mean, I spoke to Cameron Murray, who's a housing economist, a while ago, and he was talking about the housing crisis. And one of my suspicions has always been that it's one of those areas where people like to wax lyrical about how complex it is. And, of course, everything's complex in one way or another. But in another way, the issues of allocating people to housing, putting them in housing, and building more housing are actually relatively straightforward policy measures that just need, a lot of funding and a lot of political ambition, right?
Yeah, 100%, and we also know that when you invest in something and, orient your political attention to something, it becomes easier, you get economies of scale, you can roll things out quicker, you can experiment. And so, yeah, I completely agree. It's not a question of resource, it's a question of political ambition. You have to, I mean, there's a lot that I would question this government over, but, homelessness is rising exponentially across the UK. And given how easy it was in the pandemic to house homeless people, you do have to seriously question the intentions and kind of, well, I mean, look, I work for a charity and I have my charity hat on, but you have to question the objectives of the Tory party if something is such a low-hanging fruit and they still choose not to go for it.
Okay, we can leave it at that. There's just a few people have said some things that I think are worth repeating. They're not actually questions in the chat, but so Giblets for the Cats says, I've been looking for a house for 6 months. I've been regularly discriminated against by letting agents and landlords because I claim benefits, brackets, I'm disabled. Nobody is regulating or auditing them. Yeah, I'm very sorry to hear that. I think, it's absolutely disgraceful. And I feel like housing is actually an area where discrimination seems to be relatively underregulated compared to, for example, corporate discrimination in employment. You have, obviously it still exists, but you certainly have quite clear policies on that, I would say. But that sounds absolutely horrible. So I hope you get out of that situation, Giblets. Also, very nice name. James William Wisdom says, I was just evicted due to the gentrification of my neighborhood. I think there should be some compensation for my troubles, right? So yeah, I mean, in terms of prices, rents just going up, and then you finding that you can't live in the same neighborhood, I think that is pretty that's pretty terrible. And I don't know what you think of that, Antonia. Should there be compensation, or are there other policies that could help with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there should be compensation, but I don't think it should have got to this point to start off with, right? Like, I think gentrification focuses too much often on, again, this inward investment dream, bringing in a big property developer to, upskill and, develop a set of buildings to attract more money to the area. But actually what often happens, of course, the biggest problem is that local communities that have often been there for a very long time get pushed out. But what also you find is that the reason that the property developers were interested in that area to start off with, namely often, let's say a vibrant art scene, small independent businesses, whatever it might be, are not able to survive in that economy once that regeneration has taken place. And so it kind of has the converse effect. So there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of valuing which investment we bring in and why, but there's also a lot that needs to be done in terms of public institutions exploring, for example, things like community asset transfers. Instead of, their playbook is to just sell something off to the highest bidder, but community asset transfers can do a lot of the same legwork that they're trying to do with the external property developer, but without those negative effects. So there's a lot that can be done. But yeah, I'm really sorry to hear about that situation. It sounds absolutely awful. And I mean, of course, you should be compensated, but it shouldn't have happened to start off with.
Yes, thank you. I'm just scrolling through again. Okay, yeah, here's a good question, and this links to somebody else asked about low-income public housing. So Sylfrina asks, should we reconsider whether some housing should be a commodity at all? Why is housing not guaranteed for some?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's not always, housing hasn't been always valued in the current way it is. Social housing in this country was developed in large part in the aftermath of World War II, as many of our domestic properties have been obliterated, and social housing was very much seen as, one, a job creation scheme, which it should be. It did a lot for local communities, but secondly, it wasn't seen as housing for a particular sector of society. It was seen as across the board housing. And, in the early or the first few decades of social housing, you really did have, the cleaner living next door to the doctor, living next door to whatever other profession. It was seen as a baseline right, essentially. But obviously what we saw under Thatcher was the rollout of right to buy, and alongside that, this narrative built up that social housing was for some sort of underclass of our society, and with that kind of political narrative built up alongside policies that were incentivizing the selling off of housing, lo and behold, that sort of became how it's understood to be. But it doesn't have to be like that. It's one of those things that's very much around political preferences and ambitions. So, and it's it's a real shame in this country that actually we did have that initially with social housing and it was eroded.
Yeah, I think one of the housing, I mean, this is where, okay, I said things don't need to be complicated just before, but I think one of the areas where housing does strike me as certainly difficult to address is that housing in this country, and this is true in the USA as well, and some other countries like Australia, it's become a lot of people's main asset. It's seen as a financial asset. There's a huge political goal of home ownership. There's a large group of people who really depend on their homes as a financial asset, and especially as something that's going to help them in retirement. And so anything that is actually going to reduce house prices directly seems like a bit of a political non-starter to me, right? That seems like a really tricky situation when so many of the population, this is one of the great successes of Thatcher, right, on her terms, is how many people are now tied to their homes as a financial asset.
Absolutely. And, combined with that, or exacerbating that, you now have a huge number of homeowners that are asset rich but cash poor, and so day to day actually struggling with bills, etc. And so what happens if they believe that their only remaining asset is suddenly under threat? That they don't like it, in short. And so it is a political football. It's a very delicate political football, and it's, again, comes at odds a little bit with the climate crisis, because we're seeing that home ownership is generally something that's reserved for older and older people. And these are the people, when it comes to, for example, retrofitting insulation, that need to be the early adopters to kind of kickstart the market for it more broadly. And they're also, most often, although I appreciate, as I said, they're often cash poor, but they are often the group that's most able to pay for these changes as well. And they're not doing it because they're, one, seeing that technology is getting cheaper and cheaper each year, so they're kind of waiting until some I don't know, magical moment where it seems sort of viable enough for them to do. And secondly, as every year that passes, they're also realizing that they're getting older and older. And if their return on that investment isn't going to come 10, 15 years down the line, they're sort of opting to enjoy their retirement a bit more than make those changes. So, yeah, there's a lot of massive issues, yeah, when it comes to housing. And I don't really know how we crack it, because frankly, as you sort of alluded to, Thatcher's ambition to make home ownership and aspiration has become so ubiquitous. It's completely across the board, and with good reason, because if we were even trying to push for something else, the kind of wider support and policy infrastructure isn't there for that to happen. You know, we're so far from having rent controls, for example, or anything that would make, you know, long-term renting more viable, that I think the challenge for progressives is, in short, how do you align the ambition for home ownership with a more progressive economy? But it's very difficult to do.
Absolutely, yeah. So you said you weren't a housing expert, but I ended up asking you quite a lot of questions about housing. But you seem to know quite a lot about it. So let's talk a little bit about the environment, because we've actually been chatting for about 90 minutes. And you've mentioned it quite a few times. Now, obviously, I think it's probably one of the central things that the new economy movement focuses on, right? And I think there's this balance to be struck, definitely, between providing for humanity, providing for human needs, and addressing the environmental crisis, which may, on some metrics at least, require some kind of cuts to people's material standard of living. And, you know, conventional economics often puts these at odds. So I was just wondering what you thought of, you know, how does the new economy movement aim to basically improve people's lives while also reducing our environmental impact?
Yeah, so obviously the issue that I think for the rest of our lives, you know, our work is going to seek to address, and it's going to become more and more important to both focus on not only mitigation efforts but adaptation efforts, because, you know, the reality is that environmental breakdown is happening today, now, and it's going to get worse. So we need to both mitigate and adapt. But I think in terms of thinking about new economics or rethinking economics, it is literally the dominant economic model that is responsible for for environmental breakdown. So it serves the movement, you know, conversely well. And I think, you know, what we've seen is the movement's got an increasing attention coming from historically exclusively environmental campaigners that have suddenly realised that we need to actually engage with economics and change the economic model if we want to deal with this this crisis. And yeah, there's more and more acceptance that, you know, a new model is needed, and that's to rapidly, and, you know, I mean rapidly, we're really on the clock when it comes to this issue, you know, create societies that are more sustainable, you know, more just, more prepared, whilst also narrowing inequality, improving quality of life, you know, becoming better prepared all round for the accelerating consequences of environmental breakdown. And when you think about the contribution that, you know, the new left or the new economic sector or whatever you want to call it has made in this space, it's absolutely massive. You know, the Green New Deal as a concept has largely come out of this sector, you know, as well as the wider concept of a just transition. I appreciate, you know, we don't have a Green New Deal in this country, and it's, you know, unlikely that the Conservatives will implement one. However, I think it's not too far aligned to draw activity around the Green New Deal to, for example, Boris Johnson's commitment to Build Back Better. And I appreciate they're both slogans, they need substance, but once you have the slogan, then you have something to hold these people to account with, right? And then, of course, over in the States, you've seen the rise of AOC, largely off the back of, you know, her campaigning around the Green New Deal. So, yeah, I think in short, the two go hand in hand. I think the two reinforce each other. You know, the environmental movement and the progressive economic movement, they're coming close close together. And I think even more so, I would argue, although I don't think everyone would share this view, that we won't be able to transition in time without it being just, without it being progressive. And the reason I say that is because a just transition needs democratic buy-in and co-creation of policy. And I don't just say that as like a fluffy thing that's nice to have. You need democratic buy-in and co-creation of policy because you need people to move quickly on this agenda. And of course, it's not all about us giving up plastic straws, but you do need people to understand it and understand the changes that are happening and, you know, not create obstacles for their implementation. But also because of this point that I keep coming back to that we were talking about with regards to community wealth building, local people have the expertise to know what's best needed for their communities. You know, we cannot have Whitehall figuring out how to do peatland restoration in Cumbria and also figuring out air pollution in Hackney. They won't be able to move fast enough. And actually, it's, you know, the people of Cumbria and Hackney that are best placed to bring forward the solutions. So in short, I think it's really exciting to see the slow merging of the progressive economic and environmental sector. But as with all of these things, you know, a lot more needs to be done and a lot quicker.
The Green New Deal was actually a new economics foundation policy, right? If I remember correctly, I think it was their idea originally. People like James Medway and Anne Pettifor, I think, really pioneered that. And then you saw, actually, it was because they're UK based, the NEF. You saw AOC in the US actually bring it into the political spotlight. So we were talking about the influence of the new economy movement, right? Before, I mean, that's arguably the most direct one, I think, where you can see that the ideas have had an impact. So again, I think there's this interesting balancing act that's being struck here between centralized policies and localized policies, because you need the centralized resources and political will to implement a massive thing like the Green New Deal, right? You definitely need that. If you're going to invest in renewables, you're going to, you know, build new transport, you need centralized governments to make it happen. But on the other hand, you do want to make sure that local communities are not negatively affected by these projects like they have been by High Speed 2. And you need to make sure that their knowledge is harnessed to make the projects as good as they can be. So let's go one at a time. I'll start with the local because we talked about community wealth building. Now, this is one thing where I know a tiny little bit, but maybe not enough. How might community wealth building, or how could community wealth building help with reducing humanity's environmental impact? Are there localized ways to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about the road to net zero in this country, what are the three main things that are, you know, the average person's probably going to experience in terms of changes? They're probably going to experience changes to their homes. They're probably going to experience changes to their transport. And they're probably going to experience changes to what they eat, right? And so taking them in order, I've talked about the retrofit opportunity. There's, you know, a huge fundamental principle or tenet within community wealth building is the creation of locally rooted, well-paid, well-conditioned jobs. When it comes to changes in the home, retrofit opportunity provides that, you know, just like with the rollout of gas, which was centrally planned and funded and almost overnight created, you know, tens of thousands of jobs across the country. You know, the same can happen now. When it comes to changes in transport, you know, we're going to probably be needing to walk and cycle more. And then when it comes to changes in diet, we're going to need to support more local producers and more locally generative food production. So there's a lot that can happen within the local level. And also crucially, all of those things that I just outlined, you know, homes, lower carbon diet, fewer fewer cars on the roads. They're all changes that we'd want to see anyway, right? Like the climate emergency provides a new sense of urgency to them. But of course we want our homes better insulated for the fuel poor. Of course we want, to tackle obesity with more locally produced food. And, of course we want to walk and cycle more and get air pollution levels down. So there's a lot, and a lot of those things are decided upon on the local level, and there's a lot of opportunity for job creation. But one thing I would say about community wealth building and perhaps the remit of the council and the environmental emergency, there's sometimes an assumption that when you tackle things on a local level, they're inherently lower carbon. And that's unfortunately just not the case. If you have, there's been studies that show, in short, buying a tomato flown over from Spain is actually less carbon intensive because of the scale they're doing it at, and also, questionable things around offsetting and all the rest of it, than buying from a local producer that's perhaps using outdated equipment and producing on a much smaller scale, right? And then combined with that, there's correct pressure on local businesses and all sorts of other institutions to transition to net zero. And if you're a local supplier of whatever it might be, it is going to be harder, arguably, for you to transition to net zero than, for example, for Amazon, who's interested in setting up a new warehouse in your area, right? Because Amazon have the in-house expertise around decarbonisation. They'll literally probably have hundreds, if not thousands, of people working on their sustainability. So when it comes to the council and who it chooses to support in its local economy, that I do have a worry that it may come up against, basically there's a tension between environmental principles and community wealth building principles, because ultimately we want to be supporting that, locally generative business base. But actually, when it comes to environmental sustainability, I'm not saying Amazon's great, they're really quite terrible. But the point being is that big international extractive, firms, exactly the kind that community wealth building is seeking to minimize, if not remove, can put forward better environmental credentials.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, because it was kind of my concern, because you'd love to say, oh, community wealth building, it's going to solve the environmental problems as well.
I'd love to say that,
it's and basically, in short, these big organizations, businesses benefit from economies of scale, right? And so that's part of the reason that they can maybe have less environmental impact. I mean, there's this famous example, you may have seen it, of I think it's like a pear in syrup, and it's in some plastic, and it says grown in Argentina, packed in Thailand. And it's and everyone circulates it because they're like, oh God, it's so stupid. And then when you delve into it, it's like, the thing is, pears actually, there's a while after when they're grown to when they can be packed, and it actually works out as environmentally more friendly to do it that way. I don't know too much about it. I could be wrong, but certainly it's not always obvious on its face what's going to be good for the environment, and that keeping things local is good for the environment. So, but there are some things could be done. I'm a big fan of banning cars. I always go on about it to anybody who'll listen. I just think in built up areas, you essentially need to get rid of cars, except for special access and certain reasons. So on the other side of the Green New Deal, now it's an interesting example. So let me place this in the context of the influence of the new economy movement, because it seems to me that there's been a watering down of it as it's gone into the political arena, right? And it's actually become subject of the political debate. I feel like the Biden administration has done quite a lot. But there's been something of a watering down of it, and I just wonder what you think of the Biden administration's policies. I don't know if they still call them a Green New Deal. They seem roughly in line with it, and kind of what they've done right and wrong, especially with regard to the environment.
So I think they're overall good. Again, I'm not an expert on American politics. So I'm not going to speak for too long on this question. But I think what's been really powerful, because I think a lot of this stuff, to be honest, when it comes to most challenges, I think progressives, of course, there's always more research to be done, but by and large, progressives know the answers. It's about building the movement, it's about framing, it's about how they land. It's not that we're still scrabbling around for what to do. We kind of know what to do. It's about how do we get it to implementation. And something that Biden's been quite good at is quite explicitly marrying the environmental cause with economic challenges, but crucially actually kind of deprioritizing the environmental cause in his narrative. And sort of by that I mean, I sort of said earlier, think about all these changes that we need to make around our homes, what we eat, how we travel. They're kind of all changes that we'd want anyway, right? And Biden is saying that through his policies he's really framed it in a way that's going to resonate and land with the individual experiences of struggling Americans in the US, right? So he hasn't talked about, there's this big far off challenge in the future in a different country that's coming. And so now we need to make sure that our homes are better insulated, because that's a kind of disconnect that people can't get, right? But he's just talked about, are you frustrated by the fact that, your fuel bills are going up, that your whatever it might be, your housing isn't in a fit state. Oh, by the way, there's this huge new suite of policies that can create a load of jobs, better your community. Oh, and by the by, it serves the environmental agenda too. So I think, it's not really about pulling the wool over people's eyes, but people resonate with what they can see, right? And the reality is in this country, apart from obviously, the odd problem with air pollution or heat waves or whatever it might be, we're not seeing the environmental agenda. And actually what's more pressing is the day-to-day impacts of the cost of living crisis, right? But it so happens conveniently that the solutions to the cost of living crisis are also the ones that are going to make us more environmentally sustainable and contribute towards mitigation efforts, and also prepare us, adapt us to inevitable environmental breakdown of the future. So yeah, I think overall Biden's policies have been really good, but I think the reason they've had so much traction, it's not just because he's the president, it's how they've been framed. And actually, if you trace that back to even AOC's framing of the Green New Deal, it was very much about systemic and community transformation. Oh, and by the by, environmental impact too.
Yeah, it's a really good way of putting it. That was just my concern, that it basically became more New Deal than Green New Deal, right? Essentially, and you can, it's on its own, it's definitely a good thing, and you can understand why they would go with that political framing and why it would resonate with people. But I guess I just worry that we've lost it a little bit. My chat is now arguing about veganism, so we're going to swerve that one. Veganism is good, I can confirm. So in terms of renewable energy policies, that we were just talking about the Cameron saying cut the green crap, right? And how that's actually now impacted households' bills, because the thing about fossil fuels is that their prices are very volatile. They are vulnerable to political crisis in countries where they're extracted, as we are seeing now. They are ultimately finite, even if they don't disappear entirely. The costs of extraction are going to rise. And if you contrast that with having renewable energy, it seems that actually renewable energy can be much more reliable in terms of its cost. And much more sustainable in terms of its cost, as well as being good for the environment, right? So this is one of those areas where I said at the beginning, conventional economics would say social and environmental aims are at odds. There's going to be a trade-off, but actually, right, there's potentially some win-wins here.
Absolutely. We know in any sector, diversity within that sector means the sector is more resilient. So, whether that comes, anything, if we just had one supplier of sugar in this country, we'd probably expect a bit of one, perhaps a loss in quality, and then secondly, should there be any shock to that supplier, potentially a massive price rise. And anyway, it extends to energy. Sugar is a bit of a stupid example, but you get what I'm saying. We want a diversity within our energy mix and energy suppliers, and types of energy companies and organizations to have that resilience, and it makes sense. And there's often this kind of wider debate around, there's maybe some tension between you're suggesting all this growth in this area to develop this wind farm or whatever it might be, and that's at odds with us living on a finite planet. We can't have continual growth on a finite planet. But the picture is more nuanced than that. I mean, I'm not pro-growth at all costs, but the reality is, on the route to net zero, we're going to have growth in some sectors, and it's about who benefits from that growth and how it's distributed and what the growth is in as well. So I think, renewables present a huge opportunity. We know that we need a diverse energy mix to be more resilient, and I think obviously movements in Ukraine and Russia have highlighted that even more. And also, it presents sorry, the final thing I'll say, I've sort of lost my train of thought a bit, but the final thing I'll say is we also know that when it comes to renewable energy, the costs have plummeted, and unfortunately they'd be even lower still if it wasn't for Cameron cutting the green crap, as he said. But we know that investment in this area makes it a lot cheaper, and the knock-on effects are massive for the UK economy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. We have you for a little bit more, maybe 10 more minutes or something, because I've got a couple of questions from chat, that is.
Sounds good.
Yeah, cool. So one person asked a little bit ago, Fever, says, Antonia, what can I as a min-wage worker actually do in order to enact this change beyond voting left?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? Because on the one hand, we'd all say change doesn't just happen at the ballot box. It's about engaging with your local community and campaigning, etc. But on the other hand, any of that activity is, to some extent, a luxury, right? Like, you have to have a certain amount of security to be able to get involved in that wider community. I mean, I think there's always lots of things you can do. I think when it comes to community wealth building is not a particularly it's not a concept that resonates with people inherently in its name, right? And within it, it's addressing lots of different challenges. And so I think actually you have to start, if you think overall community wealth building is a good idea, that it's something that I want to support, what can I do to support it? I mean, I would just urge anyone to really think about the things that matter to them, because that's where you'll find the most motivation and energy to drive change, right? And that might be anything from, I mean, I don't know where you work, but if it's a minimum wage job in an industry that isn't unionized, perhaps you could explore unionizing it, or work with, for example, there's a suite of new unions that have popped up to help gig economy workers, for example. So there is support out there. I mean, it's difficult because at the end of the day, I come back to this point that campaigning or, even writing to your MP or doing voluntary work in your community is all very well and good for me to say. But, if you're time and cash poor, there just isn't the space to be able to do that. So, I mean, I think also we talked a very long time ago about trusted messengers in a community. I think if you don't have that luxury of time or energy to get involved in advocacy or campaigning or writing to your MP, whatever it might be, the best thing you can do is talk to people around you, and tell them about your current thoughts on this, and they're far more likely, whoever they are, to listen to you if you know them than me, and that's also part of movement building, which is really crucial to change.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. I think you got to appreciate that you are human, and humans have limitations, and especially if you're not in that secure a financial situation, it's going to be much more difficult. I would also second going with something that you love. Pick one thing that you actually really, really love and care about as an issue, because that is going to sustain you through the campaigning to have it changed and things like that. So, what? So, I don't. So, Antonia, do you know what CWB stands for?
Yeah, it's community wealth building.
Oh yeah. Oh my god, I am actually an idiot. I was thinking carbon for some reason. So anyway, Political Economy 101 asks, what can the Bank of England do to support CWB?
Yeah, I mean it's a good question. I mean, I'm actually I'll give some sort of answer, but then I'm gonna actually throw it back to you because I'd be interested to hear what you think on it. But in my mind, the biggest challenges facing local authorities in this country, as I said right at the beginning of this stream, are around funding. The average council has received cuts in central government funding to the tune of, it's somewhere between 55 and 60% at the moment. Alongside that, we have an ongoing increasing pressure on all public services, which basically means that councils are left in the position where they're delivering the same number of services with much more demand for them. So they're really on their knees, local government. And, I don't want to tar all Conservative policy with the same brush, but when I have seen more aggressive policy in action, there is a general playbook that they follow, which is cut a public service until it's on its knees, and then use kind of public angst around the fact that the service doesn't work anymore to justify further cuts, right? And that's my worry with local councils, that they're going to get cut and cut and cut. And, there's, as you said, doing more with less, but then there's just doing nothing with nothing. And I worry that, we're going to see further centralization of this country and its governance structure, and the obliteration of local government entirely. So in my mind, the Bank of England, the main thing they can do is help with funding.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Nathan Tankus, who's quite a well-known financial blogger, he has spoken a little bit, and this is in the US context, but about the central bank just buying local government bonds, the same way that it does to central government bonds. And we have a bit of a different system in the UK, but there is in principle basically no reason that it can't do that. Okay, so I've Caught Fire asks, what is the point in pursuing reforms and policy which can easily be undermined and then repealed?
Well, I mean, to that end, you should never seek to change policy whatsoever, because there's very, very little policy that, without enough willpower can't be overturned. So, I mean, I don't really know how to answer that question. I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, but I think it's also perhaps pointing to the short-term nature of politics. We lurch from government to government. Well, it's supposed to be every 4 or 5 years in this country. Obviously, recently it's been much more frequent. And with each new political office, with each new cabinet or whatever it might be, we see a new set of priorities that often, as their first act, to repeal some of the last administration's priorities, which is a completely ludicrous way to live when we're thinking about the challenges of the day and how inherently long-term they are. When it comes to environmental breakdown, we need long-term planning around it. We need to make, the state should be making investments that it can only see a return on in 5, 10, 20 years time. So it's very, very difficult. And I do appreciate that, it might feel a bit futile if we're lurching from policy package to policy package. But I think that comes back to our earlier discussion point around the fact that it's not just implementing a policy. It's about disseminating its justification, proving it works, building up a movement around it, so that that next administration finds it a lot harder, because of public resistance, to overturn or repeal it.
Absolutely, yeah. I think one thing that this brings us back to as well is means testing of individuals, not of councils, which, as we've established, is actually good. But means testing of individuals, because what you do when you have means testing is you create a class of people who have the benefit, let's just say welfare, and you create a class of people who don't have it. And the people who don't have it often feel like they're being taken from, or perhaps certain political parties or the media will make it seem that way. And then you get political division. Whereas if you have universal benefits, then people tend to be much more wedded to them, right? And they tend to support them politically. I mean, the NHS is quite a good example. We kind of love to hate it in the UK, but we do still love it. And you don't even see the Conservatives say they're going to abolish the NHS or dismantle it, as opposed to politicians in the US, where they're against universal healthcare, right? So I think that would be one of my answers, is these kind of universal policies I think can be much better politically. Yeah. So, we've got lots more questions. So, what? Oh, God. I don't know. This is a big question. Feel free to say, I don't know, it's too late in the stream, I'm too tired. Messias de Souza Bezerra, sorry, I can't read. I am also too tired. What is the new what the new left has to say about the idea of changing foreign cultures or governments through sanctions?
So, okay, that is a big question. I would say that I said earlier that I think the new left, or new economics, I mean, these are quite porous terms, right? But they're a bit underdeveloped when it comes to impact and evaluation as some of our policies. And I would also say that another massive area of underdevelopment is foreign policy. I don't think the new economy has enough to say about foreign policy. So, I'm not the spokesperson for it, but even if I were, I don't think I feel confident on, saying whether they would support sanctions or not. But I mean, I think it's been interesting to see what's been happening with Ukraine, because, as usual, progressives are kind of split down the middle, and there's lots of different camps around what should happen. However, there's been fairly unanimous support for the idea that, frankly, military measures are an absolute last resort, and all kind of other soft diplomatic efforts, measures around economic sanctions, etc., need to be, explored to the max before we resort to anything violent. So I think what I'm saying is that if, the new economy, if the new economics movement was more developed on foreign policy, they would probably support sanctions, but perhaps don't quote me on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, foreign policy on the left is a bit of a gap. I mean, economics on the left has been. The new economy movement is one of the counter examples to that, but it has been a bit of a gap for the past few decades. But foreign policy definitely is. I mean, I think sanctions can be justified on a kind of utilitarian basis. They are very high level. I do think that perhaps there's not enough attention paid to kind of ordinary Russians and how they're impacted. I will say that my first thought when the sanctions started was they're not doing enough about Russian oligarchs. They're just targeting people who are poorer. These days, it does seem that they are doing a bit more about that. So I have been kind of impressed by the speed with which they've actually sanctioned quite a lot of major Russian oligarchs in the UK, certainly. But yeah, I mean, I think foreign policy is a very it's a very second best area, in the sense that, all of the options that we have to choose from are usually seem pretty horrible in their own individual way. So it's a difficult area, and like you said, Antonia, I don't know too much about it. there's one more question, let's say. So Ben Goodchild asked, are there any known good approaches or policies to preventing local government defunding or increase local funding? Have you seen anything like that?
Yeah. Obviously councils are struggling for money a lot. So there's been more and more exploration into, I guess it sounds a bit policy wonky, but what I'd say is sort of exploring alternative financial levers, right? And one of the most successful examples of that have been an initiative called CMIs, which are community municipal investments, and essentially they're a form of municipal bond. So they're a bond that the council can issue to the local community and only to be invested into by the local community for discrete bits of work. And actually there's been a few that have been issued just in the last 6 months or so with incredible success, and they've all been issued to help with helping an area transition to net zero. So most recently, or I don't know most recently now, but definitely very recently in the last 6 months, Islington Council launched a CMI of £1 million. One thing about CMIs is they are capped at £1 million. You can run multiple of them, but they're capped at £1 million to help with distinct bits of its net zero strategy. And it's been a success. We had a lot of small scale investors come from across Islington to put money into it. And what's been found so far is that the return on the investment that goes back to the shareholders, actually by and large the shareholders have instantly said, oh no, just put back into the next municipal bond to help with the next climate project. So there are alternative financial levers, including, as I said, municipal bonds that need to be explored a little more. And while I appreciate, a lot that a lot of people are living through the cost of living crisis at the moment, there is also a section of society that has saved a lot through the pandemic and are wondering, what to do with that money, and also have a newfound appreciation and sense of the local and their community, because we obviously saw huge community efforts in helping the most vulnerable in the first few waves of the pandemic. So municipal bonds, I think, are a really interesting avenue for councils to explore with seemingly little downside other than it's new, and councils, again, as I keep saying, are incredibly stretched and under-resourced, and as it's a new concept they're not familiar with, they often don't even have the capacity to look into and set up these types of bonds.
Thanks. That's a very very nice specific answer to a very difficult question. So that sounds like a really interesting policy that's been pursued. Okay, we're gonna let you go, Antonia. So thanks for talking to us for so long. It's been really, really insightful and interesting.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed myself.
Yeah, it's been great fun, and thank you very much, everyone on chat. Love you all, even those of you who occasionally choose to spam with irrelevant nonsense. I still love you. But anyway, I'll see you all next time. And thanks again, Antonia.
See you soon.